Well, Rod Ludema, welcome to the Henry Institute in Calvin College.
Thank you very much.
It's great to have you here and to have this conversation. So you are a Georgetown economist.
Correct.
You've been working in government from time to time, including most recently as the chief economist for the State Department. You've worked in the Obama administration, the second Bush administration.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
And so some questions I'd like to ask come out of that experience.
Sure.
You became an economist at a time when you sort of cut your teeth during your trade economist, I should say.
I am. Mm-hmm.
And so you cut your teeth during NAFTA, the North American Trade
Right.
Act, which was being negotiated in that period of time, the late 80s, early 90s. You have during your career, seen the ascendancy of China into the WTO, I don't know if we would say the blossoming or the development of the European Common Market. And so a lot of experience during your career in thinking about international trade and in particular international trade agreements and institutions around international trade.
Right.
So if somebody knows that about you, as our viewers now do know, and you're in an elevator with them, and they're asking, well, why does this matter to me? All these international trade agreements and so forth. Why should this matter to me or to our country? What would you say?
Huh. That's a good question. Nobody's ever asked me that in an elevator before.
Yeah. Okay, let's say it's at 25 floors.
So why does it matter? Well, it matters because we live in increasingly an internationally independent economy. I mean, you can't escape the global market, even with even with policies that intend to kind of wall one off from international economics. It's almost impossible to do so. The technology has changed in such a way that we have open. Much easier communications, much more efficient transportation. Companies, are spanning countries. Value chains pass through all different countries. The technology has changed, and so it is no longer the case that you can think about even your own personal situation without at least having an eye on what's going on in other countries. And so what international trade agreements and international trade institutions are all about is putting some structure and some order on how the interactions between countries occur. There's a natural tendency for countries, for governments to try to react to global markets by trying to protect their own. And some of that is appropriate, but it can also be sort of mutually destructive. And so understanding where that mutual destruction is and trying to reach agreements to kind of limit that is what international institutions are all about. But they do a lot more than that. I mean, they also facilitate coordinated action on social goods like environment, protecting the environment, or labor rights or things like that. So it's hard to once you take as given that that what happens here at home is in part determined abroad. You have to start thinking seriously about how you're going to cooperate with other countries on policy matters.
Maybe I could focus on one theme in what you just said, and that's really the theme of order or predictability. That these agreements and these kinds of institutions lead to greater predictability or certainty about relationships among countries. And that predictability allows them to plan, very important aspect of the rule of law as we typically understand it. But I'm wondering if sometimes I'm thinking back, for example, to the debates about most favored nation status for China and other countries, but especially for China. There was a great deal of uncertainty because every couple of years there would be this question about whether MFN would be extended. But it was under the argument was essentially that this was for a certain kind of social good, that in fact, perhaps we wanted to use that uncertainty as a way to ensure that China would live up to certain human rights expectations. So are there times, I guess one way of asking this question, are there times where the uncertainty isn't a problem, or maybe it's an opportunity, even for supporting something like human rights?
Well, I would say that the uncertainty part of that is generally not good, and if you can avoid it, that would be best. When it comes to human rights, it's nice, it's important to have human rights as a priority, and to say, look, in order to, if you want to enjoy, the benefits of a cooperative relationship with a country that cares about human rights, such as we do, then you need to obey certain standards. Mm-hmm. So I would say that's entirely appropriate. Mm-hmm. But to the extent that creates uncertainty, I would say that that's a negative byproduct of that kind of thing. So clarity on what your standards are going to be on social issues like human rights, on environmental issues, on labor issues, and so on. Clarity is what's I think benefits everybody. Yeah. Uncertainty per se, trying to keep everybody guessing as to whether you're going to hit them or not. Right. I don't think that's helpful in an international context. In fact, I think it's quite harmful because of planning issues, because a lot of good things come from long-term stable relationships, mm-hmm. and so those need to be protected as well. That needs to be a priority as well. Sometimes those come into conflict, right? You say, well, I have a commitment to, an open market with a country, but look, they just did something. They violated, human rights, or they, or they took an aggressive military action or something mm-hmm. like that. Well, now you're stuck, with a dilemma. But certainly, if certainty and stability is a priority alongside of some of these other things, that's better than simply throwing caution to the wind, right?
Sure, yeah. So you would say that it would make more sense to build into these international agreements human rights expectations. Is that a fair idea?
I think that's entirely appropriate. Yes.
Yeah.
And to some extent, there are. I mean, to get into the, you have to have a certain level of somebody who's a continual human rights abuser is not going to be allowed into the WTO, at least in a perfect world. But the and the European Union, for example, has very very clear rules on what you need to do in order to join that group, and they're very strong on human rights and on. The United States couldn't join the European Union because of the death penalty, right? So, yeah, I think having those as conditions, is really important, both for advancing those causes, but also just to get buy-in. You ultimately, at the end of the day, what you need is buy-in from the population that's going to be operating under these agreements, mm-hmm. And if they're considered to be morally corrupt, you're not going to have that buy-in, and you're not going to have a good institution. Mm-hmm. So.
Okay, let me shift gears a little bit, mm-hmm. And think about the current moment, especially in the United States. There has been some rattling around the idea of protectionism. Mm-hmm. And part of that's rooted in some currents of populism in the United States. Populism generally has had this kind of anti-elitist tinge. And I could imagine somebody on that elevator saying, "Oh, you were the chief economist for the State Department. I think you're one of those elites." Right. So how would you respond to that kind of question? Look, haven't all these trade agreements ultimately hurt the mass population, the people, in some way? And aren't elite decisions, haven't those elite decisions and elitists been responsible for that? How do you talk with folks along those lines?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think one of the big problem, or one of the failures of the elites in my experience has been a failure to really communicate the benefits of the current system to a wider audience.
Right.
There's just sort of a presumption that, well, everybody should understand, that what we're doing is in the best interest of the country,
Right.
Without having to really go out and convince. I was part of a group that was trying to pass a trade agreement called the TransPacific Partnership through Congress before the election, and one of my jobs as chief economist of the State Department was to go out to congressional districts throughout the country and talk to groups about what was in TPP. And at some point, I didn't make the decision myself, but at some point, the decision was made that the best way to sell TPP is to talk about its benefits in terms of security, right? Security for the Asia Pacific region, providing an alternative to China, for some of the Asia Pacific countries that were currently kind of nervous about that, and really showing that I think Ash Carter, who was the defense secretary at the time, had famously said, I'd rather have TPP than another aircraft carrier, right?
Yeah.
And so it was pitched as a strategic device. Which, I was probably aimed at certain wavering members of Congress or something like that in order to get the thing over the hump. But at the end of the day, it didn't speak to the bread and butter issues that Americans were concerned about. And so I think that when the current administration, started criticizing TPP, and ultimately President Trump pulled out of the TPP, it was because that resonated with the working class, that with manufacturing states that had been taking it on the chin recently, and so it was the elites did fail, and so I don't really blame the populists for giving us a shellacking on that, but. That doesn't change the facts on the ground, which is that the Trans-Pacific Partnership would have actually been beneficial for manufacturing in the United States, because look, most of the big transformations that are taking place within the economy and abroad are technological transformations. We're losing a lot more jobs to robots than we are to the Chinese,
Right.
So, I think that what we need to do is first get that right? Let's understand the causes before we start, reaching for policy measures. And I think when you do a proper and honest accounting of some of the causes of the difficulties that communities in the United States have been facing in recent years, you'll find that there's a whole host of causes, and globalization is only a small piece of that puzzle. And being anti-globalist is probably not going to solve, and it probably will make matters worse rather than solve any of the fundamental problems. And so we elites, to the extent that I'm an elite, just have to do a better job of communicating that, and hopefully the current administration will come around to a recognition that there are other things besides globalization that they need to attack.
So it's partly about the framing of the issue. So it was framed as a security issue. It perhaps ought to have been framed as a basic economic issue with certain kinds of economic benefits. Do you see? I mean, I'm just thinking about elites who are out there now talking about these kinds of. Do you see opportunities? Do you see places where there are political leaders, other leaders who are speaking to the benefits of these sorts of agreements? Has the kind of populist wave completely captured the Republican Party and to some extent the Democratic Party, or do you see pockets of opportunity?
Well, I see the populist wings of both parties growing, but there's still a large center. I mean, at least over the course of my professional life, it has always been the Republicans that were the pro-trade party, and it was the Democrats, and particularly the left wing of the Democratic Party, that was always expressing the skepticism. Now we see that there's now a populist wing on the right as well, and that actually has a lot more in common, with the Bernie wing of the Democratic Party than people appreciate.
Yeah.
And that side's growing, but I still think there is a good middle of sort of pro-market Democrats as well as traditional conservatives, and I don't think that they're, Steve Bannon's I know has declared war on them, but I don't think that we've seen the last of them, and I certainly on the trade issues, I hope we haven't.
Yeah, it's interesting when you compare populists, people who have a kind of populist disposition. When political scientists do this and look at Sanders voters who have a populist streak, Trump voters who have a populist streak. I mean, it's where they seem to have common causes in their anti-elitism, right? So I think you're right. There are these kinds of interconnections between these two wings in lots of interesting and sometimes bewildering ways.
Yeah.
But well, I mean, another question about the current moment. I mean, do you think that in some ways the populists have a point? Or some points to make, some compelling points to make about trade agreements, TPP, other kinds of agreements that we've been negotiating. I mean, are there things we can learn from this discussion? Say, well, yeah, maybe there are refinements that we could make to NAFTA or to other kinds of agreements that we've made in the past.
Yeah. Well, I guess the first thing I would say to the populists is, look. The United States position on, the United States built the current system of international trade relations going back to the 1930s. And it has served the United States remarkably well. We often take for granted, it's just part of the furniture now, but we take for granted how much the United States has benefited from the current set of institutions that we ourselves set up and have defended consistently through Democratic and Republican administrations for decades. So first, I would say, pause a moment and realize that, look, you cannot, or you really should not throw out the baby with the bathwater. But are there things that we could improve at the margin? Absolutely. And the TransPacific Partnership took a very long time to negotiate, and it evolved over time in response to criticisms about various aspects of it. And if you actually took the time to look at what was in it, it had one of the big issues that I've always been concerned about with trade is that international trade, exports in particular, tend to be done primarily by large firms within the economy. Small firms usually only operate domestically. And so that creates a kind of, elitist divide already, right? It looks as though, it's the big corporations that are benefiting from trade. So surely trade agreements are about benefiting the big corporations, right? And everybody else, well, they don't really benefit from them very much. Well, The reason that trade is done by big corporations primarily is because it's very costly to engage in trade,
Right.
which is one of the reasons why having certainty, which promotes these kinds of long-term investments, is important. But I think it's we also need to think about, well, how are we going to get small and medium-sized enterprises more involved in trade, and so that they can be participants in these global value chains that are being created throughout the world right now. And so the Trans-Pacific Partnership had an entire chapter with various strategies. In fact, we were going to set up a permanent committee to review the agreement periodically to make sure that we were doing all we could to try and encourage small and medium-sized enterprises to participate. And there's a range of different policies that one can bring to bear in order to get at that.
Can you give an example of one of those? I'm just curious.
Well, so I mean, here the State Department, of course, was very actively involved in trade promotion. So a lot of the problems with accessing foreign markets is just gathering the information necessary in order to know whether or not your product would be well received in that market.
I see.
Right.
Yeah.
So that often requires having partners on the ground in the other country, and simply introducing, right, having export fairs where companies can come and explore and meet other people from other countries where that they can potentially partner with, have proven quite effective in bringing small and medium-sized enterprises into the global economy, and so. Doing more things like that,
Right.
and building that into the architecture of the agreements, I think was a sensible thing to do, and that was in response to this, anti-globalization. This is all about benefiting corporations. Criticism that we had. Another is labor and environmental rights. So labor and environmental rights were already built into NAFTA in 1994, but they were not enforceable. In TPP, they were set to become fully enforceable parts of the agreement, so that all countries that participated in TPP had to obey certain basic labor rights.
Yeah.
And that was why did we do that? Well, in part we did that because labor unions were pressuring us to put labor rights into these agreements. Because they felt that it was a fundamental, fairness issue, that it's not fair to ask, U.S. labor to compete with foreign labor when foreign labor has depressed wages due to lack of labor rights. So we tried to be responsive to some of the criticisms, and I think it resulted in a better agreement at the end of the day. Now, where are we now? Okay, the TPP's at least for now gone, but we are renegotiating NAFTA. And there are a lot of elements that were in TPP, like the enforceable labor and environmental rights, like digital trade issues, that I think will be incorporated into a renegotiated NAFTA, so that at the end of the day, assuming that the NAFTA negotiations are successful and they're not torpedoed by crazy demands, we could end up with a NAFTA that is actually better and more responsive to the concerns that critics have levied.
And there's a little bit of irony in that, right? Since it may come out of this experience of
the government often works in mysterious ways.
Yes, exactly. Don't I know it? Okay, well, one last question, and this is a question that really segues out of what you were saying just a second ago about fairness, fundamental fairness. Henry Institute, we talk a lot about public justice, and we think about that quite often out of the context of our own faith commitments at Calvin College. And so I'm just wondering if you think about your work on trade and these international institutions, how would you frame it? Talking about framing, right? We talk about security, economic framing, but if you were to frame it in terms of as a matter of justice, how would you think about trade in terms of justice?
Well, that's a good question as well. I mean, I've always been drawn, I think, throughout my career to the possibilities of international cooperation, in large part because of my Christian beliefs and my background, frankly, right here at Calvin College, and learning that taking a normative approach to issues, practical issues like economics, is important. It's what we're called to do. So justice is a fundamental obligation on the part of Christians, and it goes back. I mean, even if it's not just Christians, but it goes back to the Old Testament. I mean, I'm studying the prophets right now, and justice is on every page, right?
Right.
Righteousness of God is what means is what gives rise to the need for justice, not just within your country, but to all people. That you need to, it is fundamentally a part of the character of God that we should treat our neighbors near and far fairly. I think that naturally sort of gives rise to looking to cooperative solutions on international problems, first, right, rather than some of the alternatives. The other, I think, Christian value, you mentioned justice, but stewardship has also been something that is a value that I've heard emphasized ever since Calvin, and that is this idea that we are caretakers of God's creation, and I think that for me that's also resonates when we're talking about economics, because economics is all about how do you use resources, and allocating resources in a both a fair manner but also an efficient manner. Waste is bad, and I think there's a fair argument that says that competitive markets do a pretty good job of ferreting out waste, and so I've always been quite comfortable with promoting them on the global level. For that reason, but also bearing in mind that there are externalities like pollution, right, and things like that also need to be addressed. And again, since they tend to be global problems, addressing them through international cooperation is needed.
Yeah, it's complex but necessary to be thinking about this in justice terms. So, and I'm always looking for these opportunities for people to articulate a norm, especially in the social sciences, and when we're talking about social and political matters, and economic matters, the normative dimension. So, thank you for that, and thank you for this time together. It's been really edifying. And I hope our viewers find it so.
All right.
And thanks, Rod Ludema.
Thank you.